if you examine charts 6.1 and 6.2, you'll see the record for interest rates right before your own eyes on your own screen. Now, what I have here is the record for federal funds, although you'll notice all those interest rates before you on your screen, no matter which one you select, they all have more or less the same tail. Up from the 40s or 50s to a peak around 1980, down since then. Now there's stalagmites and stalactites, but the general trend is historically is up and then down. Now, out of all those interest rates you can choose on your screen, I picked the federal funds rate because it relates to the discussion we've had so far. Banks can lend reserves to one another, and they can do it day by day on an overnight basis. And the interest rate at which federal funds, and these are the reserves banks lend to one another, the interest rate at which banks lend federal funds is immediately affected by and directly affected by the Federal Reserve's policies. So, for instance, if the Federal Reserve pursues a restrictive policy and it deprives banks of reserves by selling United States Treasury securities, and bank reserves drain away, well, then banks were going to scramble to borrow reserves from one another. In other words, there's always some banks that have some excess reserves, and there's some banks that have too few reserves. What the Federal Reserve does is drain reserves out of the whole system, and then it's for the banks to adjust the amount of reserves they need in order to conduct their business. So, each day as the banks face the amount of reserves they're required to have, they borrow and lend reserves to one another. Now, if the Federal Reserve is pursuing a contractionary policy, then banks will be scrambling to borrow from one another. There will be fewer banks with excess reserves, and as a consequence of that tightening situation, interest rates would rise. If, on the other hand, the Federal Reserve, through the purchase of Treasury securities, floods the banking system with reserves, there will be ample reserves, fewer banks will want to borrow, the interest rates will fall. And so let's take a look at this federal funds rate, and just one of the rate records you can see in looking at charts 6.1 and 6.2. And once again, you can see the rise and then decline, this peak around 1980. Now, we will go into the origins of this peak. We will talk about what happened, what caused it, why we have this shape. But what I would suggest you do is go back and return to chart 5.1, the very first chart in Module 5, because in that chart you'll see the record of prices, of consumer prices. And you'll find this interest rate record follows very closely the record of prices in our economy. Inflation surged for decades, hit a peak in the late 70s, and then declined after that. Interest rates seem to follow. Why? Stay tuned. We'll discuss that in the next tutorial.